Hi friends, for Reader's Workshop today we're going to finish reading the first chapter, the stories Julian tells. So if you remember from this morning, we left off where Julian is telling his brother Huey to leave the pudding alone. He doesn't want to get in trouble for touching it. So we're going to continue that chapter right now. If I just put my finger in there, I'll know how it tastes, Huey said. And he did it. You did it, I said. How does it taste? It tastes like a whole raft of lemons, he said. It tastes like a night on the sea. You've made a hole in the pudding, I said, but since you did it, I'll have a taste. And it did. It tasted like a whole night of lemons. It tasted like floating at sea. It's such a big pudding, Huey said. It can't hurt to have a little more. Since you took more, Huey, I'll have more too, said Julian. That was a bigger lick than I took, Huey said. I'm going to have more again. Whoops, I said. You put in your whole hand, Huey said. Look at that pudding you spilled on the floor. I'm going to clean it up, I said, and I took a rag from the kitchen sink. That's not really clean, Huey said. It's the best I can do, Julian said. Look at the pudding, said Huey. It looked like craters on the moon. We have to smooth this over, I said, so it looks the way it did before. Let's get spoons. So I'm going to stop right there for a second. And your target for today is to think about the characters and their relationship with one another in order to figure out how those characters are acting. What character traits could we use to describe those characters? Okay, so think about how Julian and Huey are acting right now, just part of the story. Would you say that they're acting a little bit mischievous, right? They're both sort of encouraging each other to do the wrong thing, to keep putting their hands back and put the pudding over and over again. So I could use the word mischievous to describe both of them right now. So Julian really at this point in the story is being the opposite of an older brother, right? Older siblings usually are supposed to show their younger siblings the right way to act and the right thing to do. And Julian's doing the exact opposite in this chapter. He's encouraging Huey to keep going and keep eating more and more of the pudding. So I would say that they're acting a little bit like partners in crime right now, not exactly one acting like an older brother and the other one acting like a younger brother. All right, so let's keep going. We were supposed to leave the pudding alone, Huey said. We'd better get away from here, I said. We ran into our bedroom and crawled under the bed. After a long time, we heard my father's voice. Come into the kitchen, dear, he said. I have something for you. Why, what is it? My mother said, out in the kitchen. Under the bed, Huey and I pressed ourselves against the wall. Look, said my father, out in the kitchen. A wonderful pudding. Where is the pudding? My mother said. Where are you, boys? My father said. His voice went through every crack and corner of the house. We felt like two leaves in a storm. So picture that in your brain. Two leaves in a storm. What do leaves do if they're on the trees when there's a big storm? They kind of shake and shiver and they're blowing side to side, right? So maybe the boys underneath the bed, I'm sort of thinking that they're shaking and shivering. And that would tell me that they're feeling a little bit nervous, maybe ashamed of what they did. Where are you? I said. My father's voice was booming. Huey whispered to me, I'm scared. We heard my father walking slowly through the rooms. Huey, he called. Julian. We could see his feet. He was coming into our room. He lifted the bedspread, and there was his face and his eyes like black lightning. He grabbed us by the legs and pulled. Stand up, he said. We stood up. What do you have to tell me? He said. We went outside, Huey said, and when we came back in, the pudding was gone. Then why were you hiding underneath the bed? My father said. We didn't say anything. We just looked at the floor. I can tell you one thing, he said. There is going to be some beating here now. There's going to be some whipping. The curtains in the window were shaking, and Huey was holding my hand. Go into the kitchen, my father said. Right now. Both of us went into the kitchen. Come here, Huey, my father said. Huey walked towards him, his hands behind his back. See these eggs, my father said. He cracked them and put the yolks in a pan and set the pan on the counter. He stood a chair by the counter. Stand up here, he said to Huey. Huey stood on the chair by the counter. Now it's time for your beating, my father said. Huey started to cry. His tears fell in with the egg yolks. Take this, my father said. My father handed him the egg beater. Now beat those eggs, he said. I want this to be a good beating. Oh, Huey said. He stopped crying, and he started to beat the egg yolks. So pause right here for a second, and I want you to think about what Huey and Julian's relationship with their dad is like. Okay, so he's come into the bedroom now, and he's yelled at the two boys and asked where the pudding went. He's made them come in the kitchen, and now he's cracking the eggs and putting the stuff in the pans for them to beat the eggs and to beat the cream in order to make the pudding. So what do you think that Huey and Julian's relationship is like with their dad? Think about that for a couple seconds. So I would say that Julian and Huey probably are very respectful of their dad, right? Neither one of them is talking back. Neither one of them is ignoring the dad and sort of going on with their own thing. They both listened to exactly what he said. They both came into the kitchen. And it sort of seems like they know they did something wrong, right? They didn't admit it right away, but they're listening to the dad and doing what he's saying. So it seems like they're sort of being respectful to what he's going to say and ask them to do. So let's keep going to find out if we're right. Now, Julian, you stand here, my father said. I stood on a chair by the table. I hope you're ready for your whipping. I didn't answer. I was afraid to say yes or no. Here, he said, and set the egg whites in front of me. I want these whipped and whipped well. Yes, sir, I said, and started whipping. My father watched us. My mother came into the kitchen and watched us too. After a while, Huey said, this is hard work. That's too bad, my father said. Your beating's not done. And he added sugar and cream and lemon juice to Huey's pan and put the pan on the stove. And Huey went back to beating. My arms hurt from whipping, I said. That's too bad, my father said. Your whipping's not done. So I whipped, and Huey beat and beat. Hold that beater in the air, Huey, my father said. Huey held it up in the air. See, my father said, a good pudding stays on the beater. It's thick enough now. Your beating's done. Then he turned to me. Let's see those egg whites, Julian, he said. They were puffed up and fluffy. Congratulations, Julian, he said. Your whipping's done too. He mixed the egg whites into the pudding himself. Then he passed the pudding to my mother. Wonderful pudding, she said. Would you like some, boys? No, thank you, we said. She picked up a spoon. Why, this tastes like a whole raft of lemons, she said. This tastes like a night on the sea. So that's the end of that chapter. And I want you now to go into your own books. You're going to read for a half an hour. And I want you to think hard about the relationship of two different characters in your book. So we talked about the relationship between Julian and his little brother Huey. We also talked about the relationship between the boys and their dad. So I want you to think about the things that happen in the story and what it can teach you about the relationship between two characters, or maybe even three or more characters. All right, happy reading.